Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar this morning or this afternoon depending on where you are. The webinar today is Agile Test Management using Jira and Zephyr. Myself, Philip Lew, and we've got Chris Bland here. Hi Chris, how are you doing this morning or this afternoon?
Hi Phil, it's afternoon where I am. I'm doing great, thank you.
Great. So today we're going to have a really cool webinar with some hands-on stuff with Chris talking about how Agile Test Management and the problems in Agile Test Management are handled with Jira and Zephyr. And I'll also be talking about some issues and problems in Agile Test Management in general, and then how these problems are solved by Chris and his firm at BDQ. Chris, why don't you just keep going there? Just a short introduction to my company, XBOSoft. We were founded in 2006, and we specialize in helping firms solve their software QA problems, first starting off with a lot of consulting and working with them on process improvement, and then actually helping them with the actual execution of software testing, which, as you can imagine, oftentimes results in a lot of Jira optimization and configuration. We've got offices in San Francisco as well as in Beijing. I have been stuck here in San Francisco for about 3 to 4 months, and who knows when I'll be able to get back to Beijing. Chris is going to give an introduction to himself on BDQ. Chris, why don't you talk about your company a bit?
Yeah, sure. Thanks Phil. We are an Atlassian solution partner based in the UK. Our background was software development. We had some tools in the data quality space. In fact, we're just releasing a new add-on into the marketplace now. We're Agile and Jira experts. We have very good experience in the whole Atlassian solution stack with customers like Clarks, BBC, Betway, Direct Line and so forth. We're an approved training partner for Atlassian. So we train people, we provide consultancy, we help them with best practice and implement the Atlassian tool stack and other associated tools. We also deal with things like CI and CD. CI/CD, for example, we're dealing with Azure, a particular customer right now, to do Azure DevOps. So yeah, if it's to do with building or testing software using the Atlassian stack, we're good people to come to. We're based in London in the UK.
Just a quick thing here. You know, you're going to be getting a recording of the webinar. Chris, we are recording, right? Just in case.
We are indeed, yes.
All right. Okay. And feel free to ask questions in the questions panel for the GoToWebinar question panel. And let's move on with it. Just another quick introduction to myself. I love cycling and travel, and I work on the side. So that's pretty much about me. I try to do as little work as possible and try to do as much cycling and travel as possible, but in between I have gained quite a bit of experience in software quality process improvement and in particular in measurement of software quality.
I've got actually a lot of experience from my sins in building software using, tools like Excel and Delphi to try and manage things, and CVS back in the day, all the way through to now, thankfully, distributed systems, Java, JavaScript, etc., etc.
And you own a Bull Mastiff. You have a Bull Mastiff. Wow.
Which is fortunate, actually. Postman probably doesn't think it's fortunate, but yeah, in the UK at the moment, it's a good excuse for actually getting out and doing an hour of exercise every day.
That's a big dog, right?
He is, yeah. He's about 70 kilos, but fortunately doesn't need too much exercise. So yeah.
That means you have to carry around big plastic bags and a little shovel.
A big shovel, but yes, you're quite right.
Okay.
Okay then. Well, won't without dwelling on that too long.
Okay.
Let's get to the next. Yes. So Phil.
Yeah. Well, this all started with the Agile movement, and the thing about Agile is that it doesn't mention testing anywhere in the in the manifesto, nor does it mention quality anywhere. So I'm always thinking to myself, where does the quality reside? Where does the testing reside? And as you know, everyone is responsible for quality. So I'm always looking at these, the manifesto, and trying to really understand how we can interpret it to manifest quality. So where is testing Agile? As you can see, it's on the upper right within the daily Scrum, where everybody discusses what should be prioritized, what features need to be worked on, what blocking issues there are, what defects were found that particular day, and so on. And the thing is, how does this all get worked into the entire process, starting from sprint planning and the backlog, as well as review and so on? The testing, as you know, in Agile is done throughout the process, but a lot of times it only shows up in a certain little piece. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to implement Agile with a lot of the testing, I guess you could say, mindset of quality implemented throughout, and how we're going to implement that within Jira as well. So you notice I mentioned Jira last, and that's because really we have to get Jira to fit with what we're doing rather than just kind of taking a tool first approach. So Chris, I'm going to be typing just go in the chat box there so you can see. Okay, so here are some of the issues that we have with test management and an agile development methodology. You know, a lot of folks wonder whether or not we should have test cases at all. Maybe we should just do all ad hoc testing. And of course, sometimes you have great user stories, other times you don't. And in Agile, we've kind of changed the terminology from requirements to user stories, right? But there's still requirements, and they should be linked to test cases. How are you going to test requirements? So user stories need to be worked in with test cases, and then, you know, in real life we do test cycles, right? So we may do a certain set of tests, or we may assign certain sets of tests to certain people, or we may have certain tests that are run on some platforms but not others. So we have to think about that and how we actually implement that, not only within our process but within the tools that we use. And of course, there's a lot of reporting. You know, reporting is very, very important. I've heard it said before that our job in QA is to provide information on whether or not, you know, the software is ready, to provide information on the probability that users will find big problems and so on. And we can only do that through accurate reporting and discovery of information. Part of that, of course, is being able to find out what defects are found in what places in user stories, and being able to connect that all together. And then the last thing in our Jira process, in our Agile process, is, as I said earlier in that graphic, was integrating testing into the sprints throughout the sprint, not just at the end, because as you know, if we try to do all the testing at the end, we just never catch up, and we're always in the catch-up mode. So let's talk about putting quality into Agile, starting from the beginning, and that means going into requirements and user stories. So we have the valuable software, and this is just directly taken out of the Agile Manifesto. Valuable software achieved through satisfying the customer. And so what we have to think about is, okay, so who is the customer? So that means that the user stories are critical in satisfying the customer, and we have the valuable software piece, which, you know, valuable is a big word, but we can go into that a little bit later in terms of actually satisfying the customer and implementing those user stories that are the most important first. And of course, we've got changing requirements and regular intervals being what we call iterations or sprints. And then changing requirements, previously with waterfall, as you know, sometimes you get to the end and the requirements would change, and then you say, oh, we have to start over again, and so on. And that's why we do use regular intervals or sprints to handle those changing requirements. And so in real life, requirements change or user stories change over time as things are understood better. But the thing is that how do we implement and track those changing requirements within the tools that we use? And we're going to learn some of that today. Okay, so as you may know, epics and stories. Stories are part of epics. Epics are a high-level requirement that could contain many stories. And this really enables us to break down our work and break down our thoughts, and enables us to define tasks within a story and assign those out, because you don't want to have tasks or work units that go too big. Otherwise, it doesn't facilitate you breaking it down and really understanding it in detail. So let's look at a user story and try to break it down and analyze it. So we want to, I'm sure that everybody has seen this before, but so I won't go into it in detail. But I think the main point is that you're taking a look at this from the user's perspective, and that you're explaining the value or benefit from the user's perspective. So what do they get out of it, and what is the outcome? What I want to really achieve. A lot of times as a developer, you may want to implement something, and unless you're really knowledgeable and think from the end user's point of view in terms of what they want to achieve, you may satisfy the actual quote-unquote requirement or a user story, but not actually get done what the user wants to get done. So here's some examples. You notice that in the last, if you didn't have if you just had the I want to sell 50 shares of stock, then you wouldn't have the understand that they want to get money in their account, and getting the money in the account would be the objective. So you have to implement the whole thing. And it's the same thing about counting people that comes to your website. You want to understand the entire objective of the user story so that you can implement it correctly. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris is going to talk about how to develop an epic and user stories within Jira, and of course using Zephyr.
Thanks, Phil. So and thank you very much for that introduction, Phil. I think somebody once said to me that requirements are the root of all evil. And I think there's an element of that. If requirements aren't expressed well, or at least in a way that all stakeholders, including developers and business users, can understand, it is therefore very difficult to actually develop the correct solution that delivers the business needs. So language and how it's stored is really, really important. What I'm showing you here is this is really the beginning of creating requirements that we're all familiar with. And for those of whom are familiar with Jira, you will be used to seeing this. This is regular Jira software functionality. So our requirements in this case are held in Jira, I'm sorry, and the Zephyr part will come later. Now, an epic is a large piece of work, just typically too large to go into a set of stories. Maybe slightly vague, maybe slightly undefined, but it can be useful to gather things together. Different people can actually define it slightly differently. Okay, but I think everyone can agree on the fact it tends to span several stories. And also it may actually span several releases. In this particular case, we've got a couple of stories relating to this epic. One in progress and one to do. Now, as Phil has said, a story should be written in a way that connotes the requirements. And we've tried to do this with these two stories. So the way Jira basically exposes this, and this is the server version we're using, it creates a link to the underlying stories which are associated with the epic. And the epic is just talking about work management in general, and the two issues are, as a Jira user, I want to create a subtask for a story so I can break down work into smaller chunks. It's hopefully an expression of what the user is trying to achieve. And as a user, I want to add story points to stories. These are the two stories that are currently in the pipeline that relate to the epic. Later on, we will see how these interact with Zephyr so that we can think about how to test them. Okay, Phil.
Yeah, so everyone knows that we've been we call it sheltering at home. Some folks call it work from home. But User stories cannot shelter at home, I say, and that's because they really have to go, they cannot be in isolation. They have to go with acceptance criteria. And so unless you have a story that's complemented by acceptance criteria, it's not really a complete story. So let's take a look at, what we want to say the definition of done is, because definition of done is one of the difficult things in Agile. So let's take a look at that. So in order to have a definition of done, we have to pass through an acceptance test. So we want to write acceptance tests for each requirement or for each user story. And we want to be able to measure or say that yes, we got it done, or no, we didn't get it done. And this is the acceptance test would be the condition from the customer on whether or not you were able to complete that particular feature or functionality. And it must accompany a user story. If you don't have that acceptance test or what consists of done, then really you have a very incomplete user story. So let's go into some of the things in terms of acceptance criteria and done or not done, pass or fail. Chris, can you go through some of that?
Yeah, no, sure. So the way we can implement acceptance criteria or testing, so to give us that definition of done, if you're using a tool such as Zephyr, we can create test cases, and they're really the vehicle for achieving this. So the story holds the requirement, and the test case holds the acceptance criteria, if you like. And when we set these up with Zephyr for Jira, they are in fact a special type of issue called test, which comes when you install the Zephyr plugin. You can document descriptions of your tests and what the overall objective is. You can have attachments, you can have custom fields and so forth, because they are in fact native Jira issues. Additionally, you can also have test steps which indicate stages that people have to go through to determine whether this test is going to be passed successfully. So what you're looking at right now is a test called given an existing story, a Jira user can add a new subtask to it. So it fits with the story we previously talked about. We're describing that users should be able to add new subtasks, and in the 2 steps we're describing the actions you should be able to take and the outcomes you should get. Now it's important to save that information, because later on we will show you how you execute that, and you can actually record and report on the results of whether this acceptance criteria or test case is being met by the developed solution.
So that expected result is put into the test case as part of
Absolutely.
as part of the test case itself. Yeah, great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Plus even supporting attachments if you like. And then as you execute them, and we'll see this later on, you can have different execution statuses for each step and an overall status for the test case.
Now, would it be possible to show in the expected results an actual picture of what you expect, or is that not possible?
It's an interesting, no, attachment. You'd have to put it in the attachment, basically. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
That's an interesting thought. I should say, Phil, actually, because we've not covered it anywhere, you can import these things in from spreadsheets, so you can make it easier to get your data in.
Okay. Yeah, just getting back to acceptance criteria, you can include functional criteria, just as Chris was talking about in terms of that particular user story and test case, which implemented a certain functionality. But there's, of course, as you may know, of the non-functional requirements and performance criteria that also could be part of the not only the user story, but also needs to be part of the acceptance test. So in terms of user stories, they don't all have to be, I press this button and I get the report or so on, but could also be non-functional type user stories where a user can implement what they want to do within a certain performance criteria and get a certain response time. That could also be a user story, so that you don't forget about those important non-functional requirements that somehow seem to be addressed only at the end of a project.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you have that clear pass and fail result, what you want to do is you want to make that at the right level of granularity such that there are no partial acceptance. Either it's pass or it doesn't pass. And if you have a criteria that is, oh, well, it's almost there, or this part of it was done, but not that part, that means you need to break that down into smaller, that's indication that you need to break that down into smaller pieces in order to add certainty in terms of what is done and what is not done and what piece is good or not good. So just think about that when you're doing a test and it's only partially pass, then that test and that criteria needs to be broken down into a smaller piece. So just talking a little bit more about acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria should state an intent but not an actual solution. So if you look at these two examples here, we don't want to mention radio buttons or any particular way that something is implemented. Rather, we want to just show the criteria that is independent of an actual implementation or button or box or something like that. Lastly, about acceptance criteria, you want to have some types of standards in writing acceptance criteria. So within your organization, if you have multiple people writing acceptance criteria and user stories, then you want to have a certain format so that everybody understands the terminology that's being used and makes them independent of the particular person that's writing them, so that everybody, if you have some transitions within the organization, that way any new person coming in can clearly and quickly understand the user story and what its intention is. And it's also important to think about acceptance tests. Like I said before, we have the functional acceptance tests or functional user stories, but you can also have user stories that are implemented from a more holistic point of view, from a user's goals of getting an entire task done. So don't keep your user stories small just on the functionality, as Chris was showing in his example about implementing a certain particular function, but also a user story could be all the way through a particular path through the software where the user gets an end result. And so this would be more like a user acceptance test, which also translates into a more complex user story. So both of those things can be included as user stories and have their own definitions of done. I know I said a lot there. I hope made sense. So, so we want to have user stories that are pulled into each iteration or each sprint and have acceptance criteria that go with these user stories. And then also we need to think about who is the acceptance testing, or who are these user stories being tested by, and who gets to accept them. And so that's important to think about in terms of when you actually finish your iteration or finish your sprint and you go to the demonstration with your users or your product owner and you say, oh, look, it's done. And they say, oh, well, that's not done. And so you need to think about how can you understand their acceptance a little bit better to make your user story and criteria better. I'll let you go and show how we can connect all these things together, Chris.
Thanks.
You got a tough job.
Well, we discussed whether to do this with a live demo or presentation or screenshots, and I have gone with screenshots because when you're using a browser-based app, you can get a lot of tabs quite quickly. So also forgive me if you're not seeing the level of detail or work through that you might like. If anyone wants to discuss afterwards how things are actually done, we will of course show you. Use stories with tests, as Phil has talked about. We want the story to describe, the intention of what we're going to develop, and the tests really contain the acceptance criteria, the steps, the expected results, and they need to be linked with the user story. for traceability, so we can see what stories have got what tests. How that is achieved with Zephyr plugin is it uses the built-in Jira links. So in this particular case, I've got my story here, which is, as a Jira user, I want to create a subtask for a story. I've highlighted a few things here. We can see the issue type is story. It's part of the work management epic. I know what sprint it's currently in. I've got a description of it, and it actually links to 2 tests, and we can see here the little Zephyr logo indicating these are associated test cases. So I can see here there are 2 test cases associated with this story. Later on in the presentation, it's a few slides time, we'll actually show you the traceability report, which is quite a nice way of seeing across many stories and tests exactly what your coverage is and how stories and tests are related together.
We had a question come in just now, Chris, about running these or executing these stories and test cases against different platforms. So let's say in one, this week we want to test it against, the mobile side, and then the following week you have another test cycle that goes against, Chrome or something like that. Are you going to be talking about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. We will indeed be talking about that later during test cycles.
Okay.
Suffice to say that each test case can be associated with many different test cycles. This allows us, the idea that a test can be executed several times in different contexts. The cycle is also the way we group together tests, maybe for the end of a sprint, maybe for regression, maybe for functional, maybe for UAT. So it has the concept of groups of tests, or potentially the same tests but for different environments. Something we've done ourselves. When you ship Jira plugins, if you're supporting Jira 7 and Jira 8, you tend to end up with different versions of the plugin, of the code, but of course you want the same outcome. So it works very effectively.
So for instance, you could see whether a particular test case, for instance, you could see, okay, this particular test case, BDQ XBO5, was successful on these 5 platforms but failed on Firefox or something like that.
Absolutely right, yeah. And we will see exactly that in a few slides' time.
Fantastic. So we'll table that question for a few seconds here. Yeah, one more thing on acceptance tests. We want them to be reusable and independent, and that gets back to making them smaller. Remember, we were talking about that, such that you have good pass-fail criteria, yes or no. And then in terms of reusability, if you follow a good format and standard within your organization in writing user stories, then it certainly makes them a lot more reusable than if everybody's writing user stories in different ways. And of course, we want to also write our user stories with automation in mind. So a lot of times we may have flags on user stories, and whether or not, when the person is writing them, whether or not they think that they should be going into a automated regression test or not, and whether or not that goes into a smoke test and so on, because there are certain types of tests that you certainly want to run all the time upon code check-in.
That's very good. We could extend Jira, for example, with some customer fields, so that'd be more easy to categorize those types of stories. Right,
because otherwise you've got 1,000 test cases, and you say, okay, well, which ones should I run for for smoke tests? Well, how are you going to pick out from 1,000? Very difficult.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right. So we have another problem, as I mentioned earlier. Today we're talking about changing requirements. We welcome them, right? So let's take a look at how we welcome changes. So we want to take a snapshot of the existing requirements and develop against that, but we want to keep that record of what we're developing against, but also at the same time enable user stories to change over time, because as we get an understanding of the user story and the way that it's implemented, it may change. So let's take a look at how we can have a snapshot and also how we can keep adapting and morphing the user story to make it better. Of course, user stories, they should be broken down into tasks, and we definitely want to stick to two things. One of them is that we want to stick to quality and timeline, and keep the features within a particular sprint flexible. So let's move on, Chris. I think we're already at 32 minutes here. We got to get going.
We got to, yeah, exactly.
Why don't you go on here?
Okay. Well, just to quickly cover off that story is changing. In Jira, Jira is not a version control system in and of itself. Stories, you've got two ways of considering change. There is the activity or history tab on stories, so that actually you can see if they have been changed in the context of a sprint. You can also see if you add or remove stories from a sprint, which ideally you don't, but it will happen, that will change the scope of the overall sprint, which will impact your overall scope reporting. So you may say you've got a baseline of stories, which are the chosen stories you initiate the sprint with, but in terms of the requirements, in Jira as a whole, your baseline essentially is you can check the activity or watch it to see if anybody has changed it after the sprint has started. Now, if that is not adequate, and it is for most people because you're doing 2 week chunks. If that's not adequate, one of our other partners does have a tool. It's called RMSys, which is a very formal requirements management system where you can really freeze requirements and freeze versions. Quite often popular with engineering companies, actually. So if the baselining with Jira is not enough, there are options to make it more robust. But of course, with that comes more process.
Okay, so getting back to what we discussed earlier about being able to trace all the way from requirements or user stories to defects.
Yeah, let's I can sort of press on.
Let's go on and press on there, Chris.
Absolutely.
Talk about I think the traceability matrix is really important to be able to show how things are all connected together.
Exactly. Picture paints 1,000 words, doesn't it? So those issue links, the way we linked stories earlier with test cases. Here we can see one of the traceability matrix. It's a special report that Zephyr can generate for you. And it's possible to see how stories actually map through from requirements, which is what they are, to their associated test cases and to the executions of those test cases. We're going to cover the executions themselves in the next couple of slides. Now, if you take a look at the BDQ XBO2 story, you can see that it has 2 test cases associated with it, and in the next window we can actually see how many times those test cases have been executed and what the results of those are. Furthermore, if there are any defects, any bugs had been raised by the testers against those test cases when they're executed, those would show up in the defects pane. So we have traceability all the way through from the story through to the test cases, through to the executions of those test cases, through to defects raised while they're being executed.
Wow, that's great.
That's nice, isn't it? Yeah. So let's just talk. Oh, sorry, Phil.
Just to go on to the next slide. We're going to dive into how you, in reality, we want to plan tests and create a test plan just like the old-fashioned way, but actually thinking about how to implement test plans within sprints and test cycles across different platforms.
That's absolutely right. Let's have a look at how we can achieve this with Zephyr's test cycles. So a test cycle is a group of test cases that you want to execute. So a test case can be executed many different times in different test cycles. And here's a good example. I hope we use this technique ourselves for managing, as I say, one of our plugins which has to have 2 simultaneous releases. It's either that or it's having a load of conditional stuff in the code. So in this particular example, we've got a browser cycle, an iOS cycle, and an Android cycle. We want the same set of tests to be run against these 3 different environments. And that's how we determine whether it gets shipped or not. And I can see here that the state of these different test sets, although it's got the same test cases, is in fact different for the different environments for a given release. So that, in this case, it tells me very quickly that my general browser-based one for functional testing is okay and partly finished. My iOS one half has passed, half has failed, and Android, everything has failed. And right now I've actually got the iOS test cycle selected, and I can actually see here the detail of what's happened within that test cycle. And I can see which particular, I can see the results against the actual test cases, the high level test results. So I can see here one's passed and one's failed. And naturally I can dive into these test cases and executions to get more information about what's actually happened.
Just in case you're dialed in from the United States, iOS, and Chris, we usually say iOS, just FYI. I'm just beating your chops. Sorry about that. Keep going.
Yeah. I've said too many Osses in the past, I think that's the problem. We've talked about actually, okay, test cycles are good. You know, a test cycle is a concept of executing a series of tests, and you know, quite often done at regression time, for example, or for particular contexts. One of the ways we can try and help in an agile context, as you said, Phil, is do a cycle in a sprint, maybe many cycles. But here we've gone with Zephyr. I'm showing you Zephyr's quite nifty sprint view board, which is integrated into the Jira backlog. So for this sprint we're currently on, the BDQ XBO sprint, I can actually see the stories within the sprint, and I can actually also see the test cases that relate to that story and their status. So right now what we're looking at is, I've got a sprint, I've got a story, that story's got 2 test cases, one's been passed and one has yet to be executed. So that starts to give us this gate check. At the end of a sprint, I can see in one place my stories, test cases, and their results. So have my stories actually undergone a proper formal acceptance criteria within the sprint? That's what we're seeing here. And my final thing I was going to mention is actually just the test execution itself. Some of you might be saying, well, actually, how on earth do we execute these tests? And if you're thinking that, you're right, I've not gone into that full screen yet. And here it is. There's many other screens and there's reporting as well, but also we've only got 45 minutes. This is the test execution. We've got this information in front of us. Okay, everything you need is at your fingertips. So you know the test case and the cycle. And at the moment we're in the iOS. There we go. I think iOS testing cycle, functional testing for sprint 1. I can see the actual test case and the description of the test case. I've got the link back to the actual original story, and I've actually got the test steps in front of me. So I can just, as a tester, I sound like I'm actually reading a story out, but as a tester now, I can actually read this test case, go through my steps, set the statuses as described, set the overall status, and then just simply move on to the next step, next test and execute it. And these results will build up into those cycles we've discussed or shown before. Okay, and there's a bunch of things in here. You can see, I can see the individual steps, test data, the expected result, any attachments like images to help me see what they think should have happened. I can create some comments. I can attach things. Maybe there's a horrible bug, I want to stick it in, or indeed I can attach it to or create a new defect, a Jira bug, which you could then stick back in your Agile workflow. Anyway, that's a quick run through of how you actually execute a test, and you would go through that for several tests.
Yeah, is it possible to see which test step failed? Is that part of the test case?
It's just down here actually.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, you've got the 2 statuses there. You can have an individual status for each step, and actually in some of the reports there is a tiny little widget actually which does show you how many passed and how many failed, basically within the report. So if you dive in, you know, if you've got an overall fail, let's say on one of your tests, you can dive into it and find out exactly what's happened.
Sure, that's good. Thanks.
No problem.
So let's sum it up here, huh? So let's, you know, I think that we've covered quite a bit today. I'm just going to sum it up on the next 2 slides in terms of what we'd like you to take away. If maybe you got some peripheral information as well. Next one, Chris. Yeah, so In the beginning, I put up the graphic about the Agile methodology and the cycle, and we hope that what you've gotten out of this is that we need to think about quality from multiple angles, getting the users involved, working with developers and testers working together to develop criteria, acceptance criteria, and developing a common understanding together. So that's really important these days with working remote, and so we need to have lots of these, screen sharing sessions with each other, developers and testers working through criteria, screen shares, and so on. And I know we all get tired of these Zoom and GoToMeetings, but it's really necessary. And as testers, we need to work together in working in with the sprint and using test cycles and spreading out our effort according to where it needs to go to the most. And of course, I think we mentioned earlier about some folks say that test cases are not necessary, but without user stories and criteria for accepting those user stories as done or not done, then that implies that you have to have some kind of a test case anyway. So it's really the level of granularity and detail of the test case. You still need to have a test to go against a user story, whether or not you're done or not done. And that's up to your organization and the type of granularity that you need.
Well, and actually, Phil, I'd like to add a point actually to that. I have seen a few customers as they transitioned from waterfall to agile, their concept of testing actually did basically disappear. It pretty much stopped happening. Yeah, it did, because I think some of the problems issues you raised, there was a formal division previously where they did their requirements and they had their tests. They're probably using prints, they were using waterfall. When they went to agile, there was very much an emphasis on stories and agility and self-determination. But the testing, as you've said, there's not necessarily per se anything specific about testing the Agile Manifesto. And the concept of testing literally got lost. And I was speaking to testers and said, yeah, we don't really have a test phase now. We don't really know what to do.
Right,
right. And some of these were not small companies. So I think some of the points you're making here are really good. It's on maybe how do you, if you're transitioning to Agile from waterfall, actually how do you still take some form of formalized testing over to make sure, yeah, your cadences are shorter, but you've still developed the right thing and it works. Very, very important.
Right. Well, the QA folks have to move upstream into the user stories, and like I said, the user stories imply that you have done and not done, which implies testing. So that's important to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
One more slide before we finish up today, and I think I didn't mention this earlier, but in terms of working out your sprints and the user stories that are included in each sprint, it's important to not go too far out, because we did mention that user stories will change a lot and you forget and so on. And also you want to cut down on the amount of writing you do, right, in terms of writing the test cases or writing the user stories, which may change. So it's important to only do a couple sprints out as far as those user stories go. I did talk about working together with developers and testers, making sure that stories are testable, meaning that you have criteria that are broken down in small enough chunks that you have yes or no, pass or fail. And this enables you to, as you go through your stories, to really think through them more carefully rather than having just epic type level stories. And I hope you've learned from Chris today how to connect your defects to your stories and how to have full transparency and traceability so that you can understand what stories failed or what requirements were failed. And that's really, at a deeper level, you can try to look at what types of requirements or what types of stories usually have failures. And what we found with different organizations is that, it may be certain functionality that's always seems to be cloudy, that needs more work and requirements, or you may have specific non-functional things that tend to fail. And lastly, we hope that you've seen today how to implement these kinds of concepts with Jira and Zephyr.
Yeah, that's really great. I think if you can't write any form of testing for a requirement, that may indicate your requirement needs a bit more work.
That's right.
It's a good rule of thumb, because you may, if it's not testable, it may not actually be implementable either.
Yep. Okay, so the last slide really just says, thanks to all you folks for attending today. If you want to reach out to us, feel free. Here's all of our stuff in terms of where you can find both XBOSoft and BDQ Cloud.
That's right. Many thanks for your time, Phil. It's a really, really interesting discussion there on testing.
Yeah, it's great to be here and great to be able to work together, Chris. Thanks very much for inviting me.
That's an absolute pleasure. As Phil says, if you've got any questions, please reach out to us. You can see how to get hold of us, xbosoft.com or bdq.cloud. Reach out with any questions and you'll get a copy of this webinar recording afterwards.
Alrighty. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. All the best. Thanks. Bye.